Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. Hello, I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's Kaffeepause. At our Kaffeepause events, we regularly check in with a journalist based in Germany to talk about the news stories behind the headlines. And today, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome back Paul-Anton Krüger. He's parliamentary correspondent in the Berlin bureau of the Süddeutsche Zeitung. Paul-Anton, herzlich willkommen. It's great to see you.
Hey, greetings over the Atlantic.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to our conversation today, particularly since today is the first day when there are summer holidays in all of Germany, and we're able to catch you just before you go on a holiday of your own. Of course, the holidays are staggered throughout Germany in each of the 16 Bundesländer, but today is the first day of holiday in the state of Bavaria. And so with that, all of Germany is on vacation. But almost more important than the holiday season is the fact that before taking vacation, there's this tradition of a summer interview, the Sommerinterview. Olaf Scholz, the chancellor, seemed pretty relaxed in his summer interview a couple of days ago. But just over the weekend, Christian Lindner, the finance minister and the head of the Free Democratic Party, had his summer interview. And it seemed almost as if he was already going on the offensive and starting to campaign. Can you talk with us a little bit about sort of the different optics and mood between the Scholz interview and the Lindner interview? And then maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the interesting things that Christian Lindner had to share.
Mhm. Yeah, so there was a summer press conference by the Chancellor last week that lasted for about 1.5 hours, where he basically gave a tour d'horizon of his policies, including the budget question, including the announcement that was made at the NATO summit to deploy mid-range missiles and cruise missiles from the US to Germany to counter the Russian threat here in Europe. Christian Lindner focused as a finance minister, understandably, on the budget and basically made clear again that he does not see any reason for an exemption from the debt brake, the famous Schuldenbremse, and cast some doubt on some elements of the budget that, yeah, basically the Chancellery came up with in the last couple of hours when they were negotiating the budget. So basically, the Chancellery came up with three different proposals to spend money without needing to kind of calculate it into the debt brake. The trick that they pulled off is to use credit loans to finance certain things. So infrastructure for German railway and same for Autobahn. So the motorway, which has been organized in a private or public-private company in the last couple of years. And the third component is that they're going to use or try to use some funds that were allocated to the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau for the purposes than previously announced. And it's going to be interesting to see if anything of this is going to get challenged in the Constitutional Court again. Lindner basically announced that he's not going to take any risks on that. So his ministry is employing external law firms to double check if these plans are in line with the German Constitution. The reading is that if one of the components does not go through, it would not be a major problem because they already have something like 8 billion in the budget that are what they call globale Minderausgabe, but it basically means that it's money that is being put in the budget in the expectation that it's not going to be spent over the years. this is kind of reasonable up to a certain amount, because I mean, they always had something like between 4, 6, sometimes even 7 billion euros in the budget that have not been spent over the year. But this amount would grow to up to 16 billion if all the three components fall through, and then probably going to see a whole new wrap up of the budget negotiations that we've been witnessing through the summer in the fall again. But this will depend on the law firms and their verdict that is supposed to be due this week or early next week, because until August 15, they will have to move the motion to Parliament, because I mean it's finally the Bundestag that makes the decision over the budget.
So, Paul-Anton, let's stick with the budget for a minute. You know, over the last few months, we've been hearing that there's been a lot of tension between the three coalition partners in government to put together this budget. The government, well, and that included many late night sessions between the Chancellor Olaf Scholz, the Vice Chancellor Robert Habeck, and the Finance Minister Christian Lindner and their teams. But at the end of the day, in early July, they came together and had a budget which was shared with the Bundestag. Of course, this budget's now being reviewed, and it's likely to be a key subject of conversation when the Bundestag reconvenes after the summer break. But what were some of the issues that were creating some of the tensions between the parties as they tried to put together the budget?
Well, the major dispute is if there should be another exemption from the debt brake or not, right? So Social Democrats and the Greens have been calling for it. Foreign Minister Baerbock has said basically that there is no bigger circumstances that would justify not to stick to the Schuldenbremse than the war in Ukraine, right? Because obviously it has been a situation that we haven't been in since the end of the Cold War. Both Social Democrats and the Greens would like to use that exemption to find additional funding for some of the projects that they have been pursuing. So if you put together all the money that has been spent on Ukraine from the budget of the Bund, so the federal level, you're probably going to add up to something like 40 billion that you could take out of the budget and use additional loans to fund it. They are pointing to the US for obvious reasons, right? Inflation Reduction Act is a massive, basically deficit spending program that many people are pointing to in Germany, saying that we would need more or less the same, investing in infrastructure, in the transformation of the economy towards a more climate neutral economy and stuff like that. And the other position is Lindner, who says on his party, we wrote that clause into our constitution with a 2/3 majority. So if you want to change it, look for a political majority to change it, and there might well be one after the next election. The Christian Democrats, as of now, at least on the federal level, are rejecting any changes to the Schuldenbremse. But there's an even stricter version of the Schuldenbremse in the Bundesländer, and there most of the prime ministers from the CDU. CSU in Bavaria is different, but from the CDU are calling for a reform. And there's some pressure on Friedrich Merz and the party here in the Bundestag to kind of agree to changes. But you would need a 2/3 majority again in the Bundestag. There's a certain risk that after the next election, it's not going to be easy to find this two-third majority because AfD and has been rejecting any changes to this, and depending on how things play out, I mean, we're going to see the Constitutional Court have a vote on the new election law this week, which could again change the calculus for the next election. But yeah, there's a certain risk that you're not going to have a two-thirds majority in the next Bundestag to change it. So there's a push by Social Democrats and Greens to do it in this period, but FDP is rejecting this, and would be probably the casus belli in the coalition, basically meaning that it will break apart.
So you don't really see a change in the debt brake coming anytime soon because of the fact that there would have to be a two-thirds majority in the.
I don't see it because Lindner has ruled it out, and even if they would find a majority together with the Christian Democrats in the Bundestag, this would break up the traffic light coalition. That's pretty sure.
I mean, there were, of course, a couple of other important issue areas that do come back to the debt brake at the end of the day, but there were definitely some tensions between Christian Lindner, who's a Free Democrat, and two of his Social Democratic colleagues. Boris Pistorius, the defense minister, didn't get as much money in his budget as he wanted. And I think, if I remember correctly, Lindner's response on that was, he has this special fund, so he shouldn't really complain. But also Hubertus Heil, the labor secretary, labor minister, who's been dealing with a number of social issues around the Bürgergeld, or basically citizen funds, support funds, who also did not get everything that he wanted out of the budget. Can you talk a little bit about some of those internal tensions?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Pistorius has been asking for an additional 6.5 billion, roughly. And he did get only about 1.3. So there's quite some delta in between. The problem being that costs are rising for the Bundeswehr as well, and the 100 billion extra fund that was created shortly after the Russian attack on Ukraine originally was supposed to be used for investment in major weapon systems, stuff like that, and not in, for example, maintaining the infrastructure of the Bundeswehr. That was supposed to be paid from the regular budget, and has been changed by the coalition, which is a point of attack for the other parties as well, for the opposition parties. And a problem when you're talking about a possible expansion of the special fund, which is one of the suggestions that has been made to kind of not circumvent the Schuldenbremse, but find a way around the rules of the Schuldenbremse for defense purposes. The big problem is that the fund is going to be used by 2027, and the big question is, where's that money going to come from in the budget of 2028, right? So the budget for defense is around about 53 billion by now, and needs to go up to about 82 in 2028. And there's no clear idea how this pretty big hole of about 25 billion can be closed. When it comes to the Bürgergeld, it's not necessarily about the money, it's more about the way it's being distributed and the way to bring people back into the labor market. So, I mean, basically, mostly the liberals, again, have been asking for stiffer sanctions against folks who kind of would be able to work, to accept jobs that they're necessarily not willing to take, right? This is a big question. The calculation has to do with a budget, again, because there are estimates that you save about something in between 1.2, 1.5 billion per 100,000 people that join the labor market again. The CDU has even been saying that it would be something like 3 billion, which apparently the Bundesregierung thinks is much too high. But there's certainly an effect, and it's also a psychological effect, because if you're kind of earning minimum wage or slightly above minimum wage in working jobs, you're just gonna have a little more money than people who receive the Bürgergeld in certain constellations, at least. And this is something that causes a lot of resentment in the population and a lot of pushback against that policy that was basically drawn up by the Social Democrats to get rid of Hartz IV, which was designed under Chancellor Schröder, and a lot of people on the left wing of the Social Democrats believe costs them credibility and voters from especially working class neighborhoods.
One of our viewers just submitted a question that ties in here and that is whether the Bundeswehr budget includes any healthcare costs.
Yeah, well, the Bundeswehr budget includes everything that is needed to maintain the army, right? That includes payments for the soldiers, including pensions, and also their health plans, as far as I know. And it's also been accepted if we talk about the 2% goal at NATO. This is being accepted as spending that counts towards the 2% goal. But I mean, that's the same for all the member states, and it's basically up to NATO, which submits a yearly report to its members. And I think the number for Germany was 2.14% or something like that.
So coming back to Christian Lindner's summer press conference and the conversation, I mean, it was very interesting because one of the things that he said is that there are not any sort of natural commonalities, or that the three parties do not really have much in common with each other, and that there are actually very large substantive differences between the three parties. And one of the things that he pointed out was that the Social Democrats and the Greens would be completely willing to raise taxes in Germany. And that's obviously something that the liberals are not interested in doing. How did these sorts of statements go over that Lindner was making?
Well, that's basically the same discussion over and over again, right? I mean, Lindner says, and there's certainly some truth to it, the German state does not have the problem that it doesn't have enough money. It's the way we spend it, which is the problem, right? Whereas especially Social Democrats claim, yeah, but I mean, there's a lot of rich people in Germany that should be taxed higher, and then we would have more money to spend, right? I mean, the budget is slightly shrinking in 2025 compared to this year's budget, but still the tax revenue is among the highest in German history. So there are two sides to this discussion that you also see on the international sphere, where at the G20 finance ministers meeting, there's going to be a discussion about taxing super rich billionaires that you have more in the US than we do here in Germany, but we still have some.
That's true. That's true. Then I guess, one of the other topics that came up, of course, had to do with the opposition. He was asked if there are so many differences between you and your coalition partners, then what about the union? What about the CDU? And it was sort of interesting because in the course of the conversation, it almost seemed like Lindner was playing both sides, because he said he'd very much like to remain finance minister. And so the question is, did you have a sense that Lindner is keeping his options open with the CDU and Friedrich Merz, who's the chancellor candidate of the Christian Democrats.
He certainly is. The thing is that many liberals are quite angry with the Christian Democrats because they've been targeting them in campaigns quite successfully on the level of the Bundesländer. And there's a big fear that they're going to suffer from it in the federal elections next year. But I mean, if you want to have a majority that is rather conservative or bürgerlich, as we would probably say, I think in many ways the liberals and the Christian Democrats are closer than, for example, the liberals and the Greens, where when it comes to certain issues like immigration or the recent legalization of cannabis or stuff like that, or other more societal questions, there might be more common ground between liberals and Greens and Social Democrats, right? The interesting thing is, I mean, it's the first time in German history that we have a three-party coalition, and it's probably going to be the new normal. I mean, it's by no way certain. There's a certain chance, and certainly Friedrich Merz is aiming for that, to have another two-party coalition after the next election. But there might be scenarios, for example, where the SPD does really bad in the elections and the party kind of go through a phase of reorientation, and we're opposition then join another government and be the junior partner of the Christian Democrats and basically turn back some of the stuff that we've been doing in the last government, right? And then you're probably going to end up with another three-party coalition, because it's not certain that there would be a black-green majority, and there is certainly, at least according to the polls that we're seeing right now, no majority for another black-yellow coalition, which was a model for decades in the old Bundesrepublik. But apparently, I mean, Merz is polling somewhere between 30 and 35, rather close to 30 than 35, and the liberals are currently polling between 4 and 6%. I mean, Lindner is still kind of optimistic that they're going to be in the double digits once the election comes, and it's still a year to go. So a lot of stuff can happen, but I don't see them getting anywhere close to 50.
And a lot of people are even asking the question of whether the Free Democrats will pass the 5% hurdle and even be represented at all, right? I mean, it could go in the other direction. That's obviously a big question.
Yeah, we're going to see if we're going to still have a 5% hurdle tomorrow when the Constitutional Court comes out with its ruling for the election law, right? So
that's true. That's true too. That's absolutely true. So you know, against this backdrop, despite the fact that today is the first day of summer vacation in all of Germany, what's the political mood like? What do you observe? What do you see?
Well, I think it's a continuation of what we've been seeing, right? We have a continuing discussion about migration, and the possibility of kicking out people, especially to countries like Afghanistan and Syria. That has been a big debate, and you now kind of see those interviews that come out during summertime. It's not only the party heads, but also other people like Rolf Mützenich, who's the head of the parliamentary faction of the SPD, basically complained about the budget, complained about the decision of the chancellor, basically, and the whole government to ask the US to send mid-range systems to Germany to deter Russia. So you see a lot of the discussions that we had before the summer continuing through the summer, whereas some in the coalition would have hoped that it is kind of more quiet than it was last time. When we had the Constitutional Court basically kill off the budget, and you had the discussion going on through the whole of the summer, how this kind of is going to work out, and yeah, basically we didn't have a summer break last year here in Berlin, and it's going to be slightly less this year, but still, I mean, you can see the continuation of those discussions, which is pretty normal because we're going to see two state elections shortly after the summer break. So on the first weekend in September, we're going to have elections, and another one on the 22nd. So three Bundesländer that are going to vote for the new Landtag, Sachsen, Thüringen, and Brandenburg. And probably this is going to be earthquakes for the German political landscape, because we expect, I mean, according to the polling again, but we have to expect AfD come out as the strongest party in all three states, and it's going to be pretty difficult to form coalitions without any participation of the AfD. And there's a new party emerging, especially in the East, that was founded by Sarah Wagenknecht, a breakaway from the Left Party. She's also polling quite strongly currently, and this will gonna create all kinds of new questions and even more of a splintering of the political system in Germany, something that you could have or has that we have witnessed in other European countries, including France, certainly Austria, and I mean, the election law here in Germany is different than in France, right? So you're gonna see this fracturing playing out in Parliament. I mean, same as for the UK, right? Because it's a majority voting system. Right. You did not see the right-wing party marching into parliament as strong as it would have been in Germany. But they ended up at 17%. I think they only have something like 10 or 15 members of parliament, but I mean, still there's at 17%. And yeah, in Germany, it's going to play out more directly because we have a different election or different election laws.
But that's why, it's very interesting to watch what's going on, on the far right end of the spectrum with the Alternative for Germany, and the far left with the Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht, because we are seeing a splintering of the parties. And in some senses, Sarah Wagenknecht is not only appealing to the far left, but also to the far right extremes as well. And so the fact that she and that her party are part of the political landscape could also create a new dynamic that nobody can quite anticipate right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there was some anticipation that she could take away from the AfD, but currently in the polls, it rather seems that she's taking from the other parties, and AfD is still polling at 28, 30% in all the three eastern states that we're talking about, and Wagenknecht is faring pretty strong. So you might end up with parliaments where, I mean, the liberals are going to be wiped out in these three elections. I mean, they're not represented in two of the three state parliaments by now, but they're probably going to get kicked out in Thuringia as well. The Greens have been traditionally faring not as well as in the western part of the country, but they certainly have grounds to fear that they're going to get kicked out of the parliament as well. And in Saxonia, I think the Social Democrats are polling at 8% or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. So that's going to be pretty disastrous for the Traffic Coalition.
And so, in many senses, people think that these elections will sort of be a bellwether for the Traffic Light Coalition. Obviously, the circumstances are a little bit different, but I think lots of people are watching how the three coalition partners will fare in these elections, and nobody's very optimistic. but they're also watching how the main opposition party, the Christian Democrats, will do. And there's, some concern about whether or not the Christian Democrats might end up working with the AfD after all, because otherwise it will be very artificial coalitions that are created to try to keep the AfD out of power, out of government. Can you talk a little bit about where Friedrich Merz and the CDU are in all of this, and the likelihood of whether it might in fact come to some sort of a collaboration at the state level, even though this is something that the CDU has said it would not do?
Yeah, and I would rather think that that Friedrich Merz is going to stick to that line. There have been calls from local party members, and some of them even from state level, to basically give them a free hand to also work with the AfD. I don't see this coming in the upcoming election, but it's going to force that debate again. If you can exclude a party that comes in at 30% and is probably going to try to form a government, right? So yeah, this debate is already going on. I would doubt that this is already a bellwether for the coalition on the federal level, because I mean, if you look at North Rhine-Westphalia, has more inhabitants than all the east of the country. So I mean, federal election is going to be a different thing. But nonetheless, I mean, you could see AfD polling strongly in Western states as well. Question is, there are some polls that point towards 10%. Don't see this manifesting in the end. But I mean, as I said, it's much too early. We don't know what the US election is going to bring. We don't know what the war in Ukraine is going to be like in 6 months from now. We don't know how the crisis in the Middle East is going to play out. I mean, the German Foreign Office, as the State Department, just again called on German and US citizens to leave Lebanon. And if you're going to see another war there on a large scale, with a regional inflagration, you're probably going to see refugees streaming towards Europe again, and then we're going to be in very different circumstances in a year from now. So, yeah.
Obviously, a lot can happen. We've talked about a number of the parties and touched on the Greens, but we haven't talked too much about the Greens. And sort of in the vein of a lot can happen, a lot can change. Just last week, Annalena Baerbock announced that she would not be the Kanzlerkandidatin of her party, so the chancellor candidate of the Green Party in the elections in 2025. This came as a little bit of a surprise for some, given that she had been the candidate of her party last time around. But that was at a time when the party was polling in the high 20s, and it's a long way off from that right now. How was this decision received, or how was this news received in Germany?
Well, it was pretty clear that at some point the Greens would have needed to make a decision on that, because otherwise they would have needed to call a election among the party members who would run for chancellor by the end of July, and it was pretty clear that the party at all costs wanted to avoid this kind of infighting. And we've been reporting a couple of months ago that leading members of the party were basically saying that Robert Habeck this time was the front runner and they would support him. And this was people or party members, leading party members, that some of them at least were rather considered to be in the Baerbock camp. So Baerbock made the choice to announce her decision in an interview with CNN's Christiane Amanpour, which stunned off a lot of people here in Germany because she could have. I did an interview with her 3 weeks earlier where she basically tried to keep everything open, although we knew that it was kind of rather focusing towards Habeck. So it's not entirely clear what happened in between. There was a meeting of the what they call the Realoflügel, so the more pragmatist string of the Green Party here in Berlin, with about 300 to 400 people taking part, where apparently Habeck gave a very strong speech, whereas her speech a day later was not as well received as his speech, I would say. And there were kind of private conversations between her and the party leadership and the leadership of the Bundestag faction, where she apparently, according to our own reporting, also got the clear signal that this time is going to be Robert's time. And then she apparently made a decision to take her out of the race and announced it in this interview in the US when she was attending the NATO summit, which kind of caused some, I mean, in the first place, everybody was kind of in the party was, she's a great team player, but it became clear pretty quickly that they basically were taken by surprise, and they had designed a communication strategy to roll out that decision, and basically Baerbock prevented that by going public in this Amanpour interview.
I mean, one German journalist said to me recently, yeah, even if I cover domestic politics, I still have to pay attention to international news because of things like that. Someone else said to me that they thought maybe the reason why Baerbock had told this to Christiane Amanpour on CNN rather than at a press conference in Berlin is because she wasn't going to necessarily get as many biting follow-up questions from the journalists if she answered abroad rather than with a pool of journalists who follow her very closely. And I thought that was kind of interesting. But it also seemed to me as if Baerbock was really sort of handing off a hot potato to Habeck at a time when the party is not nearly as strong as it was when she was the chancellor candidate last time around.
Yeah, that's certainly the case. And I mean, they did not well in the European elections. They're not going to do well in the 3 upcoming state elections. And it's all going to go with Habeck, go home with Habeck. And additionally, the Christian Democrats instated a new investigative committee in the Bundestag, basically dealing with what they call Heizungsgesetz here. So basically,
the new heating law.
Yeah, basically climate protection measures that he was focused on for quite some time in office. So yeah, and the other thing is that there's probably not much to win. I mean, there have been people here in the public debate questioning why the Greens would even nominate a chancellor candidate when they're polling at 12 or 13%, right? Where you're basically not going to see any clear perspective that they would ever have a chance to nominate a chancellor. But I mean, as I said, a lot can happen. 1 year from the last election, the SPD was polling at 15%, and Scholz nonetheless won the election and the chancellorship. For the Greens, it was the other way around, right? I mean, they were polling at 25%, and then they went down in the polls and basically came in with 18%, which is 10 percentage points less, right? So a lot of things can happen, and we just need to see. One last thought maybe on this. Last time the arrangement was that that Baerbock was running as a candidate for the chancellery, and basically the deal was if she doesn't make it to the chancellery, Habeck's going to be the vice chancellor, right? There's no confirmation whatsoever that they made the deal vice versa this time, so that she has an assurance that she would become the vice chancellor if the Greens enter another government. But one thing is pretty clear to me is that a lot of people, I mean, there are voices in the Christian Democratic Party that are trying to exclude another coalition with the Greens, especially from Bavaria, from the social Christian Social Union run by Prime Minister Söder. And there are voices like Linnemann, the Secretary General of the party, who has been saying they're not open for a coalition with this Greens. So the interesting question is, what does he mean by this Greens? And I would guess, and I would say it's an educated guess, that they can rather live with a foreign policy that Annalena Baerbock has been standing for, maybe minus the feminist foreign policy, than Habeck as a vice chancellor, again, who has been basically the point of contention with many voters from the more conservative spectrum, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Paul-Anton, we only have a couple minutes left, but I definitely want to come back to something that you mentioned at the very beginning when you were talking about Scholz's press conference. You said that he talked a little bit about this announcement at the NATO summit about mid-range cruise missiles being placed in Germany as of 2026. Can you talk with us a little bit about how that news has been received? I mean, this is probably a pretty contentious issue in Germany, thinking back about the last times when U.S. missiles have been placed and located in Germany. I think it'd be very interesting for everybody to hear your take on how that is playing out, particularly given that you've previously covered defense issues very, very closely.
Yeah, it's interesting because the first reaction has been more or less mute. I mean, it's would have stirred a shitstorm 2 years ago or before the Russian aggression against Ukraine. And only now we are seeing a public debate that is to start. I mean, there's a strong rejection by the AfD and Sarah Wagenknecht and left. But now you see prominent voices from the Social Democrats joining the chorus. First one to publicly come out was leader of the who has been writing his dissertation, so his doctoral degree, about arms control or nuclear weapon-free zones, which has been a concept in the 70s that has been debated, for example, also for the Middle East, and they are kind of warning about the risks of this deployment, whereas basically the government made that decision pretty early after the Russian aggression against Ukraine, because you can find a phrase in the national security strategy basically saying that Germany is going to develop long strike precision capabilities, which is something that the Bundeswehr currently does not have, right? The only weapon system that I would put in that category is probably the Taurus air-launched cruise missile that Ukraine would love to get from us, and that the Chancellor so far has been refusing. And yeah, then came this decision out of nowhere, or this announcement that has been prepared in 10 months of secret negotiations between the US government and the German government. The US basically invented or deployed new systems. So one is the so-called Typhoon missile launcher, which can fire Tomahawk ground-based cruise missiles, as well as Standard Missile 6, which is two different systems which can be fired out of the same canister. This system, I think, has been fielded in the US late in 2023. It has been flown to the Philippines once, and I think to the Netherlands. and there's only a small number of systems. But so basically, the Pentagon had to make its planning. I think the system originally from the design was more designed for the Indo-Pacific region, because there the US has to deal with ballistic and cruise missiles from the Chinese army, whereas Russia and the US had been prevented from owning or maintaining those kinds of systems by the INF treaty that was negotiated, I think, in '87 and came into force shortly after the fall of the Iron Curtain. So now these types of systems are coming back to Europe, and there's a growing debate here in Germany about the risks being targeted by Russian missiles. I mean, Putin over the weekend made new threats, but the strategic background is that basically the Russian army has been developing systems in contravention of the INF treaty at least since 2007, testing them, flight testing them, and even deploying them to active units in the southern and the western military regions. And so apparently the German government saw a necessity to counter this. Additionally, Russia has placed Iskander short-range ballistic missiles into Kaliningrad that are at least, and several European intelligence services believe that they are actually armed with nuclear warheads. So another threat that has to be countered. And yeah, this is basically the reaction of a decision that Russia made a couple of years ago, and that's going to be, I think, hotly debated over the summer here in Germany.
I mean, it certainly seems to be being debated, right? And I what I've been hearing is that some politicians are trying to make the case for why this actually will make Germany more protected to have these missiles, while other politicians are making the case that this actually undermines Germany's defense and makes it more of a target, right? And so this is definitely going to play out both in political debates, but also in public debates in Germany.
And it's going to play out in the state elections that we just mentioned, because, for example, Sarah Wagenknecht made it a precondition to enter any coalition that this deployment would be stopped, which is certainly nothing that's going to fly, but at least she's been trying to leverage this issue, which is not really an issue for a state election, but in many parts of Eastern Germany, there's at least much more concern about Russia's answer and more sympathy towards the Russian position than in other parts of the country.
Yeah, I mean, I had heard that as well in a slightly different context, that that she had precluded entering any coalition with any party that at the federal level was sort of supporting Ukraine in this ongoing battle against Russia, because her view is very strongly that one should disengage and demilitarize and not support the conflict at all.
Basically throw Ukraine under the bus, if you ask me.
Exactly.
But that might be a government position in the US in a couple of months from now as well.
Well, so that's a perfect segue to my last question, which obviously has to do with US politics and our upcoming election. I think a number of people were taken by surprise when Joe Biden announced that he would not run again and endorsed his vice president, Kamala Harris, as as president. And I'm curious how that's been playing in Germany. Sort of what have people talked about or thought about? Certainly, it seems as if the race has suddenly become much more interesting. And if there's also a lot more energy and enthusiasm on the Democratic side, but I'd be interested in hear how Germans are following this.
At least they're following it with a lot of interest, which we can see from our readers. I mean, there's a lot of interest what is going on, that already started with the attempt to assassinate former President Trump at this election campaign event. Yeah, I mean, that's crazy dynamics that we probably never going to see in a German election campaign. I think the general reading was that it had become unavoidable for Biden to pull back. I mean, there were few leading politicians in Germany basically publicly talk about it, but I think that they all made up their minds. I mean, Scholz was asked about it and basically said whenever he had a conversation with President Biden, he came away with a very different impression, that he's up to the task, that he knows very well what he's speaking about, that he is very sharp in his thinking, stuff that was in contrast with some of the public appearances. Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I mean, the official point of view here has always been we have to prepare for both scenarios, be it another Biden administration, or in this case now Harris administration, or another Trump administration. For sure, there is a lot more concern what it would mean for the transatlantic relationship, for the support of Ukraine, for the deployment of US troops in Europe, the nuclear umbrella, stuff like that. If Trump gets reelected, there is calls to basically make sure that Germany fulfills the commitments that it has made in NATO, because he has been focusing on Germany. I mean, a lot of countries have been not living up to the 2% target in the past, but Trump very much singled out Germany, probably because of the economic success that we were having at the time. But I think there's a clear conviction as well that even if Harris gets elected, or if Biden would have got reelected, that this nonetheless means that Europe and Germany has kind of to do more to keep up our own security, and not kind of delegate it to the US and play a stronger role, for example, in the Middle East or in Africa, whereas probably the US is going to focus more on Asia, something that basically started under President Obama.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think obviously there are lots of open questions in terms of how things will develop depending on who moves into the White House. By the same token, as we've talked about today, a lot is happening in German politics as well, and so there's a lot to watch on both sides of the Atlantic. But as ever, Paul-Anton, it's been great to speak with you about what's going on in Germany and to get your sense of the relationship as a whole. I look forward to future conversations with you, because obviously there's a lot to follow. But first and foremost, I wish you and your family a pleasant vacation, a good holiday, and much relaxation.
Thanks a lot. Enjoy the summer. I hope you're not kind of in the steam bath of DC. But yeah, see you after the summer. Thanks a
Sounds
lot.
good. Take care.
Bye
Bye.
bye.